So from our letter to the Hebrews, let us hold fast to the confession of our hope without wavering. For the one who has promised is faithful, and let us consider how to provoke one another to love and good deeds. At my request, we celebrate today, transfer, the feast of Julian of Norwich. So a noted expert on Julian, Robert Fruworth, an American, was invited to lead a quiet day at London's St. Paul's Cathedral on the most famous phrase in Julian's writings, all shall be well. You know it. All shall be well. Yes. And all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. As with most quiet days, after he was introduced and the participants were given some basic orientation to the day, a deep silence descended upon the gathering. Yes, this would be a day to soak in what was said without the burden of having to ask intelligent questions or make any kind of vocal response at all. Don't know if you've been to a quiet day, and it's relieving somehow. And so Fruworth began his first meditation. He offered some background on Julian, when she lived, what she did, along with a brief description, just a telegraphic description of what he believed the idea of all shall be well meant within Julian's writings. And of course, those aren't Julian's words, those were Jesus' words to Julian. It's not a little catchphrase she made up, it was what she heard our Lord saying to her. This was when, in the quiet day, something completely unexpected happened. Without any hint that he intended to break the norm of silence for the day, a participant shouted out one loud word. No, he said. Thunderstruck, Fruworth stopped speaking and simply waited. He was, after all, a monastic. In response, the man went on to explain his outburst, and here I'm paraphrasing a bit. No, he said, what Julian says about God and our relationship to God simply can't be true. How can God take everything in our lives, the failings, our failings, the sufferings, the painful experiences we have buried long ago, Fruworth said, the things that are in the basement. How can God take all those things and make them well? And so the quiet day did not turn out to be very quiet at all. For the speaker went with it rather than tried to shut it down. I give him credit for that. But instead, the day became a spellbinding, transforming, vigorous dialogue that Fruworth later turned into a book entitled Drawing on This Love, Growing in Faith with Julian of Norwich. How can God take everything, and I mean everything, in our lives, the failings, where we've disappointed ourselves and others, the sufferings, the painful experiences that we buried long ago, the things in the basement. How can God take all those things and make them well? And I would add to this question, how can God take all the things we see going on in our world? And you're up close to it all. You're up close to it all. I just watch it on NPR from Canada. It's a different experience. How can God take all the things we see going on in our world, at home and abroad? The things we can only stand to look at for a while. The things we have a hard time burying. We'd like to bury them. and put them in a basement. How can God take all those things and make them one? And so who was Julian? The writer some have called a quintessential Anglican in her view of God. Who was the woman whose feast day we remember today as this convention begins? Who was the God she glimpsed in her visions? And what might her experience offer us today? So just like, and I love that in the reading of the gospel we supplied the fact that it's Jesus' dialogue with the Samaritan woman we're listening in on. That gives that passage a whole other piece. In the biblical text, it's she, and you've quite rightly added, the Samaritan woman is talking to Jesus. So just like with her, Julian was not Julian's given name. She's nameless. She's nameless. Julian is simply the name we know her by. Born in 1342, in her 30s, she had a near-death experience. She fell very ill and was close to the point of death. A priest visited her, always helpful with the crucifix, that he held up for her to see. Imagine. And this somehow prompted a series of visions in which she had a direct, that is, a mystical experience of seeing and conversing with God. After surviving her illness, Julian wrote down a short version of what she saw and heard, not wanting to forget it. And then 15 to 20 years later, as she reflected on it, she wrote a longer version of these same visions, adding more theological and reflective material, probably inspired by her rich pastoral relationships. For you see, Julian was so moved by her visions that she became what's known as an anchorite. That is, someone who lives completely apart and cloistered, in a sense, by themselves, solitary from society. In her case, in a cell or a hut, connected to the Church of St. Julian in the town of Norwich, from which she gets her name. She got her name from the church's name. Her cell had 3 windows. One onto the church itself so she could participate in the prayers and in the Mass. One off to the side to receive food and to hand out any waste. And one facing out onto a busy lane in Norwich, a window that enabled her to offer others spiritual counseling. 3 windows. But just as important as knowing these things about her, we need to know something of the world that she belonged to. The world that those seeking her spiritual counsel would have lived in. For most people during Julian's time, England would have been a very difficult place to be alive. It would have been a world of pain, suffering, and fear. It would have been a world of poverty for most of the people she talked to. It would have been a world of political and civic unrest. It would have been a world of disease, the plague, twice in Julian's lifetime. In fact, some people believe she was a married woman with children, and husband and kids had been killed in the earlier plague during her life. That's what some people believe. How could someone have such compassion without having actually walked that road? And it would have been a world in which the church's focus, with such an awful day-to-day life, the church's focus was on what one needed to do to get into heaven, but more so to avoid the fires of hell after death. In a sense, to avoid the suffering of life going on after death. And so for the people of Julian's day, God was primarily a judge, the one who sorted out the good from the bad, the worthy from the unworthy, and dealt with each accordingly, the good gaining eternal comfort, and the bad suffering eternal pain. And if you walk in the cathedral in Norwich, and there is a cathedral there, you can see depictions of the fires of hell all over the place. Julian would have seen those. Julian would have seen those. So into a view of God that is primarily about judgment and all the anxiety, fear, or overdeveloped sense of righteousness, as we could identify with that God, that such an image of God gives us, into this comes a young, nameless woman who glimpses and experiences something completely different in God that all begins with the cross of Christ. And before I talk about it, it's so interesting because I wasn't aware what the music would be today. And the music is very uplifting, isn't it? And when you think about music that is uplifting, that has its roots in the experience of the Black community in the U.S., you know where that was, the crucible within which that was made. You know the cross is in the background. So Julian gives an entirely different view of God that begins with the cross of Christ, begins with that crucifix, what she saw there, what she felt there, what she took away there. Julian glimpses in her visions the cross of Christ, that is Christ's tender humanity, and sees that through it, all our failings and the pain that our failings cause us, all the sufferings of those both closest to us and those far away, all these things are somehow comprehended by and caught up in God's long, faithful process of making things well. Though sometimes we cannot see it, we cannot know it. And this is not a quick or glib conclusion about life that Julian somehow comes to that sort of skips over an awareness of the depth of human failing and suffering. And you in this diocese know something of that depth. It doesn't skip over. This is not some glib phrase that coming off of Jesus' lips. Rather, in her writing, she gently but persistently interrogates, kind of like the fellow in the Quiet Day, interrogates the crucified Christ about how this can be. What she learns from him is that God's compassion upon our plight and our compassion for others is the key. Fruworth said it's all about compassion. And the first movement is Julian's feeling compassion with the crucified Christ, feeling into the Godhead, feeling into that, and that's everything flows from that. And that this same compassion opens up our participation in God's making all things well. It also, she says, and think about it in our music, opens up our access to joy, to bliss in this life, not at some by and by now. Give me more of that. Said, give me that religion, please. Let me offer that religion, please. Let me be a vehicle for that religion, please, to others. Because we have a world hungry for authentic joy. And so in Julian, this nameless woman, we have a countercultural, prophetic, pastoral presence of sorts, someone who unflinchingly looked upon the broken and suffering world of her time, but did not see there a God whose energy was a judging and condemning energy. Rather, through Christ crucified, think of Paul, she saw a patient, compassionate, loving God whose faithfulness endures from age to age, who has made, who is making, and who will make all things well. Where in your life does your life depend upon hearing this? that God is making all things well. Where do you need more compassion from God about you? And where might God be inviting you to have more compassion for yourself or for others, for those closest to you or for those you work alongside? Or this, where in this diocese or in the world this diocese inhabits, do you see a patient, compassionate, loving God at work, making all things well? Where do you see that God still has work to do? And how can your compassion allow you to participate in that work? And finally, how do you stay in touch with joy? How do you stay in touch with joy in who you are and in what you may do? From Julian's writings. And then God showed me a little thing, the size of a hazelnut, in the palm of my hand. I looked on it with the eye of my understanding and thought, what may this be? And it was answered generally thus, it is all that is made. I marveled how it might last, for I thought it might suddenly have fallen into nothing for its littleness. And I answered in my understanding, it lasts and ever shall last, for that God loves it. And so everything has its being by the love of God. In this little thing, I saw three properties. The first is that God made it. God made it. The second is that God loves it. God loves it. The third, that God keeps it. God keeps it. But what is this to me? Truly, the Creator, the Keeper, the Lover. May the Creator, the Lover, the Keeper be among us and with us this day and evermore. Amen.